You better look out. We're on the highway to the danger zone. Tune carefully, or your lead will definitely get blown.
It only matters if it ladders. Comment below as we walk through the third week of Aether Drift Standard. Alrighty, this week, due to an influx of RCQs, we were able to get complete results from 14 major tournaments worldwide. And a quick side note, for those of you who are watching this that also put up these tournament results, please upload more than just the top deck. The competitive community needs more context than just this deck won the tournament, nothing else is in the top 8. However, coming in first for the second week in a row is Zur Domain, claiming 13 top 8s and 3 trophies on its way to the top.
Oh yeah, excited about that. Second place belongs once more to Esper Pixie, an archetype that has struggled to find its footing in a world embracing our domain overlords once again. This week, the little Pixies snagged 13 top 8s and 3 trophies of their own as well. Special shout out to the top 8 from Montana that nicknamed it Dirty Mike and the Boys.
Oh god, millennial humor at its peak, I love it. Azorius Control rose to third place from obscurity as predicted last week in our Ahead of the Curve segment, pulling off 13 top 8s and a single trophy along the way. Stay tuned, gang. Stock up stonks are rising.
Gruul Leyline quietly rounds out our tier list with 7 top 8s and 2 trophies, making it the most efficient high-performing archetype this week. Just when you think you're done with Turn 0 Leyline, back it comes, ready to ruin your day.
Speaking of decks that can ruin your day, Mono-Red Aggro kicks off Tier 2 as a large percentage of the field correctly guessed that Domain would struggle more with this version of Red than the Gruul Mice of old. However, 13 top 8s later, not a trophy was in sight for the hasty boys this week.
Yeah, and Gruul Mice fell all the way to Tier 2 as well, with only a modest 8 top 8s this past week. Will the Mice find a pivot back to the top, or are the glory days past them at long last? We will discuss more later on.
Jeskai Convoke managed to snag a Tier 2 spot this time around with 5 top 8s and 1 trophy of its own. If Authority of the Consoles isn't around to slow down Imidane, expect this archetype to punish you accordingly.
Last but not least, Jeskai Oculus grabbed 5 top 8s, though 0 trophies, as it clawed its way to the final slot in our tier list this week. Will the eye in the sky be a mere drive-by, or will it fly high? Tune in to find out why.
Over in Brewer's Corner, I'll take a look at Mardu Discard and Bant Cage, each making it to the top 8 of their local RCQs.
And I'll be highlighting the latest Boros Mouse update while taking a look at unique Dimir Toxic list that won its RCQ. But now, let's shift gears and fire off our Tier 1 breakdowns, starting with Domain.
Bobby Schultz smashed through a 25-player 2-slot RCQ in New York over the weekend with Zur Domain, notably taking down Mono-Red in the semifinals, despite the matchup being unfavored typically. So let's take a look at this build. First and foremost, Pest Control is in the main over the third Get Lost. That is one hell of a hard hedge against Pixie and Convoke, though I'm sure it paid the occasional dividend against red-based aggro lists. Let's also note that we're up to 3 Tashana Tidebinder sitting here in the sideboard, along with 2 Negates, an Elish Norn, and a Nissa. That to me says we're trying to beat the mirror. We're definitely going for it, and those cards are all perfect in that matchup. 3 Cavern of Souls is back in the mana base, probably due to the rise of Azorius Control. I think we're prepping for our opponents to have counterspells, and we're saying, nope, Overlords are getting through, Zur's getting through. You're not stopping us today, Satan. And last but not least, a 2-2-2 split of Lockdown, Day of Judgment, and Sunfall. It's nice, it's balanced, it makes it really difficult for these Pixie lists to know when they need to hold up Spell Pierce, because maybe you're on 5 mana and you just have a Lockdown. So it's kind of a nice balance. I like where they're going there.
All right, it's interesting to see Domain evolve even further. We've seen Domain be an archetype for quite some time now. One notable change, though, for all these slots that are coming in, are we finally able to cut herd migration now that the mana base is more reliable?
Yeah, and I don't even know that it's necessarily that the mana base is so much more reliable that you don't need herd domain or herd migration. We can call it herd domain. That's what it gives you. But I think it's more so that the top end of your curve no longer cares about that. You know, like Herd Migration was great when it was a filler role in the early game and it was a beast of a card in the late game. But if you're going up against Azorius Control, try resolving a 7-mana sorcery through a wall of counter spells and tell me how that goes. You know what I mean? Like, it's not good against the aggro decks. It's not good against the control decks. It's not even that good against the mirror. I think it just got ground out by the fact that the format is at polar extremes right now. Neither of them favors Herd.
Okay. Yeah, that was one of the mainstays in all of my domain iterations, so I'm actually pretty sad to see it go, but you are absolutely correct. If we're going to have Azorius Control back in the format, we got to watch our dirtles. We got to, be able to get rid of the sacred cards to us and be able to be more efficient, more streamlined. Domain is no exception to that rule, so yeah, bye-bye Herd Migration. But let's talk now about another deck. Speaking of streamlined decks, let's talk about Esper Pixie.
CFT SOC 3 took down a 255-player MTGO Showcase Challenge on Sunday with Esper Pixie beating Mono-Red in the finals with their build. And let's note here that's 2 lists that had to take down Mono-Red to get to the top. So this teched out build, like, how is Pixies beating Mono-Red? Not supposed to be a good matchup, right? However, if we look at this build, Preacher of the Schism is in the main. We are not playing Optimistic Scavengers. We're not trying to go as low to the curve here. We're playing a grindier game. We've got 2 Overlord of the Balemerc in there as well. There's even 2 stock up. So you've got 2 ofs on these 3 cards that are all grindy value cards that allow you to beat the mirror and that allow you to really push hard against other decks like, for instance, Mono-Red, who struggles traditionally with getting through Preachers without forcing a 2-for-1 interaction, especially when you have this town ain't big enough to make sure that they're not scaling past you with Manifold Mouse, right? They also have those 2 temporary lockdowns in the sideboard and an additional Preacher there. So what you're seeing is an Esper Pixie list that says, I want to beat Domain, I want to beat the Mirror, and I want to beat red-based aggro. This list is doing a great job of all 3 from what I can tell.
Yeah, wow. How does this deck stay and maintain its dominance? It's certainly a puzzle. But, I see 3 copies of Dreams of Steel and Oil on the sideboard. We've talked very briefly about this card in the past. We've talked about it more extensively in the Discord. When do we bring these in?
Well, I mean, you're going to bring these in against Oculus. It's absolutely an Oculus killer, and that's what it's there for. But outside of that, I can see arguments for a variety of matchups. Anything where you are looking at disrupting the average mana cost being higher or the graveyard interaction being critical, right? So Domain would be fine because you can grab those Overlords early, and you also can prevent some of those Analyze the Pollen tricks that they're going for. Not always, but sometimes. Oculus, obviously, it's great there. I don't know that there's a lot of other matchups for it because you don't want to be playing that necessarily in aggro mirrors where it could just be a dead draw by turn 5. So,
yeah, definitely want to avoid that situation. I've had that problem before, just main boarding it. So I do prefer that card in the sideboard for that reason. And yeah, even though you only listed 2 matchups, those are some decks in our tier list, and specifically Domain at the top of the heap. Yeah, I think it definitely helps there. So yeah, I'm with you on that one. All right. Let's talk about. Oh man, I I get shaky when I talk about Azorius Control. Why is this deck in tier 1?
Max, doesn't it feel like 2 seasons ago when we were sitting there taking a bet over the summer for whether Domain would have more trophies or Azorius Control, and we're here, it's a year later, and we're right back at it. It's Azorius Control and it's Domain, right? There's a few other players at least this time, but Chris Patlejo took down a 27-player RCQ in Oregon last Saturday with Azorius Control, again taking down Mono-Red in the finals, making this the 3rd straight deck we're featuring that had to beat Mono-Red to snag a trophy, and this is a pattern worth noting. But this build in particular is an intriguing one. There is a push for 4 Meticulous Archive and only 2 Restless Anchorage in this split, which tells me that 1, they want those Flood Farm Verges turning on immediately. 2, they're not really worried about the chip damage from Restless Anchorage. That's a line that they don't care as much about. They're really all in on that 4x Jace in the main plan. I also note that they're on 4 split-ups in the main. That's kind of wild that we've pushed into split-up. We're not doing temporary lockdowns. We're not doing Sunfalls. We've only got 1 Day of Judgment. It's a very anti-aggro push towards the main board. And the last piece I'm going to note just really quickly is that Change the Equation is a 2 of in the list. And that might be the tech moving forward.
I agree. Change the Equation. Don't sleep on that card. I mean, that's actually been in Standard for quite some time, but it's been a little bit of an underused, not as well-known counterspell. So, talking about Azorius Control, typically, especially when you think about Pioneer or other older formats, you see, lots of counter spells, lots of interaction that way. Here, we're seeing, and I was asking Athena about this in the Discord. We're seeing a lot of win cons for an Azorius Control deck. So, talk to us about the counter spells. Do we need more counter spells in the main, or are we okay being a much more aggressive control type list?
I think stock up has shifted the way that we have to approach control. So, a year ago, we were sitting here with Wandering Emperor and friends, and we had Memory Deluge, and we could just interact at instant speed and grab card advantage. We don't have those options anymore. What we do is we have stock up. So we're playing more of a tap out control build where we're saying what we have is good, cheap interaction early on, and then just sledgehammers in terms of card advantage and win cons as we get farther and farther into the game. And that's really what this deck is doing. Do I think we need more counter spells? It very much depends on where the format's at. For instance, let's say the format was 100% red-based aggro, like it's Gruul Leyline, Gruul Mice, and Mono-Red. Well, then I'm playing for Change the Equation in the main board, and I'm not looking back, right? So what you can play with control, the composition of a control deck is completely dependent upon the threat base you expect to see your opponents on. And right now, based on the threat base, I think it's got a good balance of counter spells. I don't know that we need to overload those because there are a lot of aggro decks in the format that will just get under you. Like the counter spells are not 1 mana. They're minimum 2, which means if you're on the draw, they're getting their first and second turn drops out before you even have a counter spell online. Thus, you can't really overload on counter spells, or else you're leaving yourself open to just getting, okay, Heartfire Hero, Manifold, Mouse, all you've got is counters in hand. Fantastic, you're dead in 3 turns.
Yeah, it's not the same standard it was a year ago, I'll tell you that. All right, but let's get to some more aggressive creature-based strategies here. We're at the bottom of Tier 1. Let's talk about Gruul Leyline.
Con Man. What a great name for this. 59-player MTGO challenge was won by this individual last week with Gruul Leyline, continuing to baffle all the haters and managing to surprise an Azorius Control opponent in the finals. Let's look at how they shifted this list. Obviously, not a lot. This list is pretty tuned up, and there isn't a lot of room to go with these Leyline lists. Like, ultimately, end of the day, you look at these lists, what can you move around? The 3 Snakeskin Veil and not much else, right? Like, you're going to need the rest of this stuff. I'm happy that they're back on the Slick Shot show-offs. Those have been in and out occasionally, but like if you're going to play Leyline of Resonance, that is the Slick Shot deck to me. That is a deck that pays off the velocity of Slick Shot the best. And also Slick Shot gives you that extra dimension against control decks where they're like, okay, we're just going to hold up counter spells, and you go, okay, well, I'm just going to basically suspend or plot 2 or 3 of these show-offs and wait for the turn you only have 3 mana and then push them all into play and beat you.
Okay, all right. Look, this list swaps around its main cards quite often. It's known to do that, Gruul in particular. But look, I'm seeing Slick Shot back in the deck. I'm also not seeing Manifold Mouse. So talk to us about that switch.
If everyone's going to go into Wraths, if everyone's going to go into temporary lockdowns, Manifold Mouse scaling Heartfire Hero no longer matters as much because you can expect both to be wiped out in the same turn, right? Whereas Slick Shot allows you to, again, stutter step. You can plot, have it sit there, and then your opponent just has to respect the fact that on any given turn, you could explode for 10 to 12 damage, right? Like, that is the problem with trying to contain Slick Shot. There's no way to really interact with it once it's plotted. So against control players in particular, you can just put them into a weird resource war where they cannot contain what you're trying to do eloquently, and thus they have to let them through. And at that point, you take the game over. And that's the issue with Manifold, is that you are committing to the board with Manifold. You are not with Slick Shot.
Those are very good points. The meta has shifted. I think, yeah, I like Slick Shot, and I think you present a really good argument for why. It's a very nuanced argument, a very nuanced take. So, Brewers, pay attention. I think that's a very good point that you raise. That does it for Tier 1. Let's switch over now to Tier 2 and talk about another red-based deck, Mono-Red Aggro. Mega Venusaur got all the way to the finals of Saturday's 255-player MTGO Showcase Challenge before losing to Esper Pixie. So let's take a look at this particular build and what's different here. I do want to note, and I'm not necessarily saying I agree with it, depends on your local metas, right? But no Ghost Vacuums in the sideboard. And, very clean sideboard. We've got 4 copies of Lynx. We've got 4 copies of Questing Druid. We've got our Lithomanics, Torch the Towers, Obliterating Bolts. We know exactly what we're gunning after. We know exactly what we want to do with this deck. No Ghost Vacuums. And I think that's just a testament to the fact that sometimes you just have to focus on the matchups you can win. Speaking of which, we're seeing Verges in the mana base. The full set of Questing Druids in the sideboard. I think this signifies that the grind is just more significant now. We're dealing with control. We're dealing with domain. This deck is finding itself in situations where it's going to need that extra card advantage in the mid game. We're also noticing a swap. The 2 frenzies that we saw last week have been swapped for Obliterating Bolts in the sideboard. Notably, Bolt can target a range of creatures. 4 toughness butts are common, but also planeswalkers. So we're worried about Kaido again. Esper Pixie is more consistently playing Kaido. So I think that's what that is an indication of.
Yeah, when the format's going to rotate away from playing a lot of Shellys and push more into Kaido, then Obliterating Bolt gains a lot of value. I'm with you on that. But I look at that sideboard, Max, and we've got 4 Questing Druids. There's only 4 Verges in the main. It's reminding me of that list we took to Atlanta and did so well with, where it's like Gruul Light, essentially. But there's no Copperline Gorges in this build. My question is, when are we sighting in those Questing Druids?
So, like I was saying, the grindier matchups, we're starting to see a shift towards those decks. Typically, the grindier matchups, you're dealing with mid-range, you're dealing with control. Pixie in particular is going to actually board out Kaidos in the post board and bring in tons of removal against you. That's what they're planning to fight a creature-based red deck. And so this really just gives us just enough to maintain pressure in the face of tons of removal, tons of board wipes from decks like Domain and Azorius Control now. I think the grind mindset is important here for the post-board Red Aggro deck, and Questing Druid just fills in that slot very well, so why not go all in on a full set?
That's fair. Now, if that is Gruul Light, let's get into Gruul Heavy and talk about that one.
All this nuance. This is 2 weeks in a row of me having to talk about very similar decks all together, lumped together in Tier 2. But we have Gruul Aggro here, and Hareta Kaizu made it to the finals of last Saturday's 35-player God of Standard trial in Tokyo with this deck. Eschewing the usual sideboard, Hareta went for a more balanced approach, and it really paid dividends here. So I just want to note more consolidation overall from last week. Like, we know exactly what we want. We've got lots of play sets going on here. 3 copies of Obliterating Bolt in the main over the 1 copy we had last week. Obviously, I just said this, it's Kaido. 3 Questing Druids, again, because, the grind has come back. 3 Ridgelines and no Soulstone Sanctuaries in the mana base. I think we're having an awareness here of board wipes. Your creature lands, they tend to go around those. Maybe we need those. Maybe we're back in that grind mindset. We need the Restless Ridgelines, whereas the Soulstone Sanctuary gets wiped. 3 Pyroclasm in the sideboard. We are dealing with other aggro decks that have swarm strategies like Convoke. And then we're also up on a Sunspine Lynx, up to 3 now in the sideboard. Again, complicated mana bases, grind mindset, Domain, Esper Pixie. They're going to get punished by that card.
That's fair. And I mean, I look at this list with all those 3 ofs in the sideboard and all the 3 ofs in the main, and it feels like it's trying to figure out what the weakest 3 of is in the main board and just straight swapping it post board, which that's a clever way to go. It's a simple way to sideboard, and maybe that's working out well for them. But the piece I'm missing here, Max, is we don't have Burst Lightning in this list anymore. Is it the end of Burst Lightning? Is that era gone for Gruul Mice?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a shift this week due to just the meta changes. It might come back. While, Get 'em Dead Red really wants to do that Burst Lightning kind of thing, hit you in the face, kill you as quickly as possible. It may not even have as many creatures as a deck like this would. I think the Gruul version wants to grind it out a little bit more. Questing Druids, we're also seeing an additional Paw Patch recruit. They're ready for the single target removal. We're seeing 1 more Sentinel in the sideboard, now up to 3 as well. So, that's pretty much a mid-range card. I think it's just more diversity in the meta. I don't think the types of decks have really changed it up. I think the quantity, the population numbers have changed. People are choosing to pilot, more unique strategies. We're seeing Omni combos still in the meta somewhere, lurking around. We're seeing Jeskai Oculus, some innovation there. I think it's just, more diversity in the meta, equals these sorts of changes.
I mean, you're not wrong. When you got to balance against 10 decks, it's a lot harder than when you got to balance against 2. And speaking of one of those 10 decks that people try not to deal with, but occasionally run into, Jeskai Convoke. Let's talk.
All right, the lone swarm strategy here in Tier 2. Andre Nedelusko took down a 24-player RCQ, and I'm probably pronouncing that name wrong, but in Germany this past weekend with Jeskai Convoke, lacking the typical shell and flipping a few key flex slots to push through their local metagame. So let's take a look at the differences here. We've gone with 2 sheltered in the main, 4 case of the Gateway Express in the main board here. So the removal suite, very important. 4 case, you notably see that from Convoke whenever they're having to deal with some sort of, kind of early to mid game aggression, creature-based strategies. Those are very critical. The shelters also, we're not seeing 3 copies or 4 copies. We're only seeing 2, but it's still an indication of an aggro-heavy meta. We've got a couple of Bunicorns here in the main board, 2 more in the sideboard for power. We've also got, notably, no Spell Pierce. We were talking about the balance of Spell Pierce to protect the Negotiators a few weeks ago or last week. We're seeing no Spell Pierce. We are, however, seeing a full set of Protect the Negotiators here in the sideboard. Is this because of more mid-range in their local meta? We've also got the 3 torches to kind of hedge against aggro, notably not 4. So I think these are just signs that their local meta is a little bit different than ours here, stateside. Nonetheless, this is just a good example of how you tune for what you expect to see at your local tournament.
Couldn't agree more, Max. Now, I look at this, and there's a playset of Regal Bunicorn. 4 bunnies hopping along. What do we want them in? Where do we want them?
Oh boy, little bunny frou-frou. This card, it does hit hard, especially in this shell where you've got a lot of artifact tokens. Here, you're popping them out from turn 1. I think we want this card when there's a little bit less board presence in our opponent's deck. So if you're dealing with a combo, a control list, you really want to hit them in the mouth. You want to be able to do that, and that feels good when you do that against one of those decks. We're seeing combo, we're seeing control back in the meta. I think Bunicorn is just it's hard not to include that in your Convoke list when you're dealing with so many artifact token creators. So yeah, I think that's where we see the extra Bunicorns come in.
So long as Wizards does a secret layer with Monty Python and the death version of the Bunicorn, I am all in on having Bunny around forever.
Let's go.
Speaking of, let's talk about Jeskai Oculus.
I'm going to butcher this pronunciation as well. Holwiger David made it to the finals of a 17-player RCQ in Austria over the weekend with Jeskai Oculus before losing to Zur Domain. So let's talk about what happened. Let's look at this list. Look, we've got 2 copies of Destroy Evil in the main board. This is different from last week. I think this is an indication that we're ready for RIP. We're ready for Rest in Peace to come back into the meta. We've had our vacation away from graveyard hate. For weeks and weeks and weeks, I was talking about how there wasn't enough graveyard hate in these decks, and we are seeing Rest in Peace in Domain. We're seeing it in Control. We're seeing it in the sideboards of Esper Pixie as well. So ready for that. 2 Surveil lands in the mana base. Also kind of new from last week. Really helping to get things into your graveyard. I think that's just an indication that that's what we want to do here. Much of their turn 1 plays are very reactive to the opponent. So, I usually say you bring in the tap lands whenever your turn 1 plays aren't as significant on the play. If you're being very reactive, I think the surveillance are appropriate. And then I just want to mention really quickly, from 6 potential board wipes in the sideboard to just 1 Pyroclasm, and instead replacement with a couple of sheltered by ghosts, a Ride's End, single target removal. That's an interesting choice. So maybe we are facing a little bit more mid-range friendly, bigger, bulkier creatures in the meta. So maybe that's what that's an indication of.
I mean, I'd believe you on that one. That said, Max, there are 3 Spell Pierces between the main and the side. They didn't beat Domain in the finals despite 3 whole Spell Pierces. Is this a bad matchup and we're just not used to it, or what do you think happened here?
I think it is a bad matchup. Domain's ability to snowball really presents a problem for this deck. It has Ride's End, full play set, Sunfall, sometimes 2, 3, 4. If you're running Frillback in the sideboard with Domain, typically 3 copies is what you see. That matchup gets even worse. And like I was acknowledging earlier, Rest in Peace is also becoming normative, as typically you see 2 copies of that in sideboards running white. So I don't know. I think the Graveyard Hate has come back. Spell Pierce isn't what it used to be, and the grind means that the games are longer. So cards like Spell Pierce become irrelevant more likely as the game gets on. So yeah, I can see where that would create a formula for trouble for Jeskai Oculus in that matchup.
That's fair. And that is going to wrap up our tier list and bring us on to my favorite segment every week, Brewer's Corner. Max, let's go ahead and kick things off, and let's talk about Boros Mice.
All right. Shout out to one of our Discord members and one of my personal friends, Gilbot9000, who loves playing that. He only plays this deck when he plays Arena. He's not a Magic player, but he'll play this deck on Arena Ladder and have fun with it. And so this innovation, I suggest it to you, my friend. But Jesse Lorilla top 8'd in RCQ with this list. I just have to point out the new innovation here. Light Wheel Enhancements. Triggers Valiant. Gets around Ride's End, right? Because you're not tapping the creature, and that piece of removal is very ubiquitous right now in the meta. So max speed, if you achieve that, you have an ability to replay this. That's reminiscent of Sentinel's Eyes, if you recall that card, and that card is still seeing play in Pioneer. Cheeky House Mouse, you get more Valiant triggering, but you also get a pretty decent body out of it as well, and it's a mouse. You know that becomes subject to all the bonuses that you can give mice in this deck. Untimely Malfunction in the sideboard is certainly spicy. All the modes on this seem useful for the current meta. You can divert a removal spell, destroy an artifact, or get through with some big time damage in the end. So the mouse package and the Boros shell really leaning into Valiant, also with the Sword Master. So Boros seems very appropriate for mice right now. Let's see how this deck does. I want y'all to pick it up and play it and let me know.
I mean, it's spicy and it top 8'd in RCQ, so it's got some merit to it, and I love that they found a way around Ride's End, and it's such a it's such a stupid card, but it works, and I love that it's there. Like, it's so derpy, but it just works. Yep. So I'm here for it. I'm here for it. Anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about Mardu Discard. Shout out to John Corpora, top 8 of an RCQ in New York with this list. I spent a little while trying to sort out what it was trying to do, and I love it. Like, this is a list that's super spicy because you are utilizing Guardian of Nubenalia, Inties, and Phomos to discard into the graveyard, and then you can go ahead and pull them out with Zorline. When you're discarding, you get value off of anything from Monument. And of course, you have the ability to just kind of start lobbing Thrill Seekers really quickly at everybody. So I don't know, like, look at the amount of interaction we have. We have all this removal early on. We've got tons of reanimation for value here. And post board, Lorns ×3, Pest Control ×3, Sheltered ×3. Like, we have heavy hitting sideboard cards here from the white side of this deck. And I'm here for it. With the way this is positioned, I don't think this is the final iteration. I think it's going to take a little bit of time. The fact that Mycosynth Gardens is in here is also spicy as hell. Being able to copy monuments and get multiple in so that when you FOMO, you're triggering like multiple times. I love that. I love that. This is just such a cool list. There's a ton to work on here. Highly recommend you take this one over to Arena, put it on the ladder, and start messing with it, because I think there's something real here. And it's just the first iteration, gang. It's time to start tuning.
Couple of spicy win cons in here, making use of Voldaren Thrill Seeker while it's still in the meta, and Monument. I was wondering when we were going to see a Monument deck come across the Brewer's Corner, and I like this. I like this Monument discard low curve deck. I definitely want to try it out myself. But I'm here to present another list to y'all. Oh my gosh, the return of spell-based Poison, Dimir Poison. Daniel Edelman, first placed, took down an RCQ in New York with this list. Spell-based Toxic is back. My gosh, I remember the frustration of playing against this deck on ladder months ago, but full set of Vraska's Fall. We've also got the full set of Prologue to Phyresis. You play those cards, you add the first poison counter, and then after that, you just tempo your opponent, proliferating those poison counters the whole way through. So what have we got? What's the spice here? 4 copies of Tale of Tameo. This is going to draw you cards every time it phases over, every time, because every other card in the deck is an instant. So of course you're going to have 2 types of the same card. This is going to happen quite often. You're also in that final phase of this card, dumping tons of poison counters on the opponent, proliferating, basically, in some cases, just insta-killing your opponent in many ways. So 4 additional counter spells as well in here, in addition to the the typical one we're seeing. Reject Imperfection. I just want to note that in the sideboard. And I also, the spice in the sideboard, the 2 copies of Aetherize, beautiful against the swarm strategies, beautiful against creature-based token decks.
Honestly, Max, I looked at that list and at first I'm like, how's this one? I'm like, oh right, if you play Domain and Azorius Control a majority of the time, how the hell do you lose? Like they're gonna get rolled by this deck. Can you imagine? Oh my god.
Yeah,
you're sitting there with Leylines. Look.
Yeah, I love these decks that are just built to target like the top decks in the meta and nothing else. Like you gotta love the haters.
Oh, this hates so efficiently. This was somebody who lost to Zur's Domain one too many fucking times and said never again and made it. So. Anyway, speaking of some interesting variants, though, let's talk about Bant Cage. So this is a lot of work to get 3 counterspells and 2 Mockingbirds into a green-white deck, but damn it, we went after it. And to be fair, it might be correct, because Mockingbird being something you can grab as a tutorable target from Brightglass Gearhulk is not a small thing. And this is the build that's all value. You know what I mean? Like, we are playing Selesnya Cage, all value, maximum value, and then post-board getting the counterspells we need to try to keep up with the Domain matchup. I don't know that it's going to have a positive Domain or even control matchup, but I know that this deck can outgrind pretty much any mid-range matchup, and it's well positioned against most of the aggro field now that it has Brightglass Gearhulk to just snag that little Basilisk Collar along with a piece of removal known as Dusk Rose Reliquary, and you just have options there. Against Oculus, you get both Ghost Vacuum and Soul God Lantern. Like, there's a lot of hateful tutorable targets that allow you to, it's not so much a silver bullet as it is a soft hedge that you now get to implement against a variety of matchups, and that's just an incredible way to build the deck.
Yeah, wow. The cage decks are still evolving, and don't sleep on this archetype. It's still definitely lurking around. I think it's a tier 2.5. It's just waiting for that next tuning, that next evolution to really push through. So we've seen it in the tier list before. It could come back, maybe as Bant. I'm excited.
Absolutely. And that's going to bring us to our final segment, Ahead of the Curve. Now, Max, as per usual, we looked at 12 archetypes in our recap. Now, what are you playing going into week 4 of Aether Drift Standard?
All right, so I took a look at last week's Kokawa Tsunao's Rakdos midrange deck, and it was on the Brewer's Corner. It did take down tournament in Japan, and Japan, they have typically a little bit of a different meta than we do, so it's always exciting to see what they're cooking up over there. I tuned it for Arena Ladder this week. I wanted to crush all the way to Mythic. I think we need a proper midrange deck back in the Standard Meta, so this week I'm pushing Rakdos Demons. All right, not gonna lie, Torch the Tower is hot. This is premium removal right now. I like it over cut down. The fact that it can exile so many different things right now in the meta, especially against your aggressive decks, love it. Bitter Triumph also. You got to have the Bitter Triumphs for the Kaidos, the few little Planeswalkers that we're still seeing. Let's talk about the aggression though. Burnout Bastronaut. Notably, triggering Ob Nixilis, potentially twice if you get it to max speed, do the double strike thing. Why not? Ob Nixilis is a demon in Rakdos colors. We're playing with the Annex package. Let's make him work to the utmost. We've also got Gastel Thrill Seeker coming in, boosting you to speed 2 right on that turn that comes in. Also triggering Ob Nixilis. Thrill Roller, Gastel Thrill Roller, really a card that is hard to stop. It evades board wipes. You can discard it pretty much safely if you're playing against the Pixie decks, playing Hopeless Nightmare. It has recursive power from the graveyard. Just discard something else, bring it in, get 4 hasty damage. This deck runs aggression from really turn 1, turn 2, all the way through to the mid game, and that's exactly what we want. We're seeing combo, we're seeing ramp, we're seeing control, and one of the best tips I can provide for facing off against a meta filled with those decks is to keep your pedal to the metal, keep pushing. You really have to turn on the gas and not stop, and I think this deck just does just that all the way through to the mid game. So I'm going to see how far I can take this, see how much we can tune it. This will be my starting point here. And I think we just have to do that kind of strategy if we're going to have any kind of hope against the diversity of decks we're seeing in the meta right now.
I'm with you on that one. And I mean, Demons is a list that feels like a sleeper always. Like every set that comes out, I'm going to be checking and rechecking to see if we get like one decent 2 to 3 drop Demon that allows that to go over the top. And we're getting closer. I like that this is a Rakdos mid-range build. I think it has a lot more reach because of that. And it's a lot less reliant on a linear package. You have a multitude of ways to push forward. That Ob Nixilis is not a small amount of advantage if you get it going. But for mine, Mono-Red Aggro. All right, so, dear listener, if you consider the format revolves around Domain, Pixie, Azorius Control, and one of 3 red-based aggro variants, the question for how to approach this metagame becomes nuanced. Do you play one of the big 4 and try to tune with soft hedges for the meta? Do you play a tier 1.5 to tier 2 deck and hard hedge for it? As much of that as you can, or do you pick an off-meta brew and try to gain significantly in your margins from your opponent's misplays despite the power level disparity? Now, I pushed Mono-Red Aggro because it's got a streamlined game plan that punishes opponents for stumbling and missequencing, and it keeps making the finals of major events over and over. And that was one of the things we talked about throughout this episode, is that it kept being the end boss at all of these different tournaments, which tells me that it's right up there in tier 1, even if it's technically in tier 2. And if the world is hellbent on stopping a scaling Gruul build by implementing wrath effects and lockdowns, I want a version of Red that's going to sacrifice longevity for momentum and add back in that reach of 8 burn spells in the main. So that's why I landed on this. I think I'm 6-0 with it on the ladder right now. It's been just running through Domain players who are rage quitting. So that's been fun.
I always said the best way to beat Domain is to get right underneath it, and I think this kind of shell is probably going to achieve that to the utmost. So, not surprised to hear that you're 6-0 already. Wow. But that about does it. Oh, man. I can't believe we're already done with this episode. Y'all, it has been, how long has it been, Rictus, since we've been doing this show? It's been quite a while. We can count that in years now. And we are well past the halfway point to our goal of 10K subs, y'all. Really, subscribe to the channel. Subscribe now while you can, because we have more content coming down the pipeline in the near future. Possibly more shows. I don't want to announce too much yet, but we want you there on the journey to bringing competitive Magic back to YouTube.
And I can tell you right now, that song 99 Bottles, we got 99 episodes. That's where we're at. We've been doing it for that long. Next week will be episode 100. So you put that as every week we're doing an episode. We got a couple of years in there now with the breaks that we've taken. But that said, last but not least, please like, share, comment on this video, show support for the competitive community by doing that. It doesn't cost you anything. It just takes a little bit of time. We appreciate having all of you here. And until next time, untap, upkeep, resist.